If you think dealing with the tax office today is frustrating, imagine living in medieval Europe, where the local lord's men could show up at your door demanding a share of your harvest, your livestock, or even your labour. Medieval taxation was a complex, often brutal system that funded kingdoms, built castles, and paid for endless wars. But how exactly did it work? How did kings and lords actually collect what they were owed from millions of peasants spread across vast territories with no computers, no banks, and often no money at all? Let's dive into the fascinating and sometimes terrifying world of medieval tax collection. Medieval taxation wasn't built on income or purchases like modern systems. It was built on land and the obligations that came with it. Nearly everyone in medieval society owed something to someone above them, creating a pyramid of payments that stretched from the lowliest serf all the way up to the king. At the bottom were the peasants who worked the land. Above them were local lords who controlled those lands. Above the lords were greater nobles, and at the very top sat the monarch. Each level extracted wealth from the level below, and this extraction took many different forms. The most common payment wasn't money at all. It was labour. Under the system of corvée, peasants owed their lord a certain number of days of work each year. This might mean ploughing the lord's fields, repairing roads, or helping to build fortifications. In France, peasants typically owed several weeks of labour annually. This wasn't technically a tax in the modern sense, but it served the same purpose, transferring wealth and productivity upward. Before the lord came the church. The tithe was perhaps the most universal tax in medieval Europe, requiring everyone to give 1/10 of their produce to the church. This wasn't optional. It was enforced by both religious and secular authorities, and failing to pay could result in excommunication, which in a deeply religious society was social death. Parish priests would literally count your sheaves of grain at harvest time. They knew how much land you worked and roughly how much it should produce. Hiding your harvest from the tithe collector was both a sin and a crime. The church maintained detailed records and wasn't shy about pursuing those who tried to cheat. The tithe funded local parishes, monasteries, and ultimately the vast wealth of the medieval church. It built the great cathedrals that still stand today and paid for the armies of monks who preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages. Beyond the tithe, peasants owed various payments to their feudal lord. These varied enormously by region and even by individual manor, but some were nearly universal. The most basic was rent, paid for the right to work the land. This might be paid in money where currency circulated, but more often it was paid in kind, a portion of the harvest, a certain number of chickens, eggs, or pigs each year. Manor records from medieval England meticulously detail these obligations down to the last hen. Then came the various fees that marked the major events of peasant life. Getting married? You paid a fee called merchet. Inheriting land from your father? That required a payment called heriot, often the family's best animal. Using the lord's mill to grind your grain, you paid a fee for that too, and in most places, you were legally required to use the lord's mill rather than grinding grain yourself. So who actually showed up to collect these payments? At the local level, it was typically the lord's officials, the reeve, the bailiff, or the steward. These men knew every family on the manor, knew their land, knew their livestock, and knew roughly what they should be producing. The reeve was often a peasant himself, elected or appointed from among the villagers. This put him in an uncomfortable position, enforcing obligations on his own neighbours. But it also meant he knew exactly who was hiding grain in their barn or understating their harvest. The bailiff was usually a step above, a professional administrator who might oversee several manors. He kept the records, heard disputes, and reported to the lord or his steward. These men had real power in peasant communities, and they weren't always gentle in exercising it. For royal taxes, collection became more complicated. Kings couldn't personally oversee every village in their realm. Instead, they relied on a system of delegation that was prone to both inefficiency and corruption. Kings had their own revenue needs, and these were substantial. Wars cost money, lots of money. Building castles cost money. Maintaining a court cost money, and the regular feudal dues from their direct vassals weren't always enough. When English kings needed to raise funds beyond their normal income, they often turned to extraordinary taxation. The most famous example is the Danegeld, Originally raised to pay off Viking raiders, but later transformed into a general royal tax on land. This required a sophisticated system of assessment. The Domesday Book of 1086 was essentially a massive tax survey, recording the resources of nearly every manor in England so the king knew exactly what he could extract. It listed landowners, how much land they held, how many ploughs worked it, how many people lived there, even how many pigs and sheep grazed the pastures. This level of detail was unprecedented in medieval Europe and gave English kings a powerful tool for taxation. One solution to the problem of collection was tax farming. Rather than trying to collect taxes directly, a ruler would sell the right to collect taxes in a particular area to a private individual. This tax farmer paid the crown a fixed sum up front and then kept whatever he could actually collect. This system had obvious advantages for cash-strapped monarchs. They got guaranteed money immediately without the hassle of collection. But it also created obvious problems. Tax farmers had every incentive to squeeze as much as possible from the population, far beyond what the official rates required. The system bred corruption and resentment in equal measure. In medieval France, tax farming became particularly notorious. Royal agents would assess a village at a certain amount, then tax farmers would use whatever methods necessary to extract it. Villages that resisted might find themselves facing armed men. The system contributed to the deep peasant hatred of taxation that would eventually explode in countless revolts. Peasants weren't passive victims in this system. They resisted taxation in countless ways, from the subtle to the violent. The simplest form of resistance was hiding wealth. Grain could be buried in pits. Livestock could be driven into the forest when the tax collector came. Peasants developed sophisticated techniques for appearing poorer than they were. Communities also resisted collectively, using the courts to challenge assessments they considered unfair. Manor records are full of disputes over exactly what obligations peasants owed. These legal battles could drag on for decades, and peasants sometimes won. When legal resistance failed, violence was always an option. Medieval Europe saw numerous tax revolts, from local riots to massive uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. That rebellion was triggered directly by a poll tax that peasants considered unjust, and it came terrifyingly close to toppling the government. Over the medieval period, taxation gradually became more sophisticated. The use of money increased, making it easier to standardize payments. Written records became more detailed, making evasion harder. Central governments developed more professional bureaucracies to assess and collect taxes. By the late medieval period, kingdoms like England and France had developed relatively sophisticated tax systems. Regular assemblies like Parliament in England or the Estates General in France gave subjects a voice in approving new taxes, though this was always a negotiation between crown and nobles rather than true representation of common people. The medieval tax system, for all its brutality and inefficiency, laid the groundwork for modern state finances. The techniques of assessment, record-keeping, and collection developed in medieval Europe would evolve into the tax systems we know today. Though thankfully, no one demands your best pig anymore when your father dies. If you found this journey through medieval taxation fascinating, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more medieval deep dives. I'll see you in the next one.